Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And we're talking about a documentary, What She Said, The Art of Pauline Kael. This looks like it came out in August 2018 and it's been doing the rounds on festival circuits.
Yes.
And it's just recently, I think maybe the end of last year, come out on streaming, which is how we watched it today. It tells the story through interviews with people who knew her, through fellow critics, through her daughter, of Pauline Kael's life, how she got into reviewing, how she started, what her reviews were like, her effect on the industry's effect on her, all that sort of thing. And I thought it was a bit of a hagiography, to be honest.
I just didn't think it was a good film. So, I love Pauline Kael. I love her work and her sharpness and her wit, and I still reread her and she still makes me laugh out loud, actually.
She made you laugh out loud during the film. Her reviews, or segments of them, are narrated by Sarah Jessica Parker.
That's right.
And they were making you laugh.
They were making me laugh, yeah, she's funny.
Yeah.
But the film is like a bore, I think. It has its uses, so, for me, as an admirer, it was wonderful to see home movies of her. It was wonderful to see, the likes of Norman Mailer and, all those film directors and so on commenting on her. It was wonderful to finally see what her daughter looks like, which, in reading about Kael, you read a lot about her daughter. So all of those things are good. I also thought, actually, that what you're calling a hagiography is a much needed corrective, because, so much of what you read about Kael is as this harridan, as this power-mongering, person who, developed all of these critics, but only in relation to her own needs. And so I think her daughter's kind of closing statement saying, she was unaware because she thought that if you had good intentions, if they came out of a good place, then it's
anything you did was good.
Anything you did was good.
Yeah.
Right? So getting people a job is, not necessarily power-mongering, and actually even the way that Paul Schrader described it, or one of the critics described it, she said, she would call you and say, oh, we must support this film, it's a great film and it needs our support. She said, well, if you turned her down once or twice, then she would stop calling. And you think, well, duh, right? Who wants to impose after the second? Yeah, but they make it sound as if she's doing something terrible, whereas, she's just doing something polite as far as I'm concerned, right?
Well, she's doing something that not most people would do.
Yeah.
Most people wouldn't bother doing that. And they also talk about, when she read something that she liked, she would immediately try and track down the author, call them, tell them she liked it, and people sort of said there's a stalkery aspect to it possibly, but they also say, which I think is correct, it's actually a really nice thing to do. Most people don't do it.
Exactly. And
she's aware of how hard it is to write and get published, they say.
Yes.
And you're right, and so it's worth finding the person to say well done.
Yeah, so I think for me all of those things are a very necessary corrective. Right?
It's interesting, obviously I've not read enough and read around enough and read enough about her, not least to say read enough of her, because my impression of her is not one of the harridan that you say that people talk about her as. It's of this woman with this great reputation for writing honestly and engagingly and interestingly and insightfully about cinema.
Well, she definitely also has that reputation. But she really rubs men the wrong way.
That certainly comes across in the film.
She really rubs academics the wrong way, right? Because, academics want to make things scientific, in quotation marks. They want to create categories. They want the categories to fit. Whereas, her take is on intuition and her own individual responsiveness. And, you can then disagree with her. And actually, one of the things that many lovers of her criticism, all agree on, is that you often disagree with her. And actually, disagreeing with her didn't make her less of an interesting critic, right? And you could disagree with an evaluation of the film and find, her description of a performance fantastic and illuminating, right? Like, kind of something doesn't have to be perfect to be good or interesting or valuable, right? Or somebody doesn't have to be you to be interesting, right? Yeah. So I think kind of. To me, she remains the most important American film critic ever. Yeah, and I include everyone else in that, from AG on down the line, and I've read them all. No one is near her, no one gets close to her. You know, she writes in a way that is a pleasure to read. So one of the things of the film that I found very illuminating about the film is how often her writing was attacked. Yeah, that kind of, you know, during that whole of the first year at the New Yorker, she would get letters about, you know, people kind of saying that she can't write. And I see that very interestingly reproduced in current debates about grammar, right? You know, because kind of grammar is there to help you, or to help the writer be understood, right? It's not there to police how other people use language. Yeah, you know, and certainly I think it's a power mongering thing, because it often means that you're creating barriers where people of different classes or of different ethnic groups and so on are not allowed to communicate in their own vernacular, in their own way of speaking, right? Or to kind of bring in language and choice of words. I mean, it was interesting to see in the film how so many of the fights with Willem Shawn was not about grammar, it was about word usage. You know? Yeah. I mean, anyway, so...
Well, I think that the examples that you saw, there were a couple, were about word usage, and there was a conceptual aspect to it as well. There's some line about how a film looks like a latrine, the way it's shot. And I don't think it's the word latrine, but it's the idea that we should even be talking about that.
Well, exactly, right? So, so I found all of that quite interesting.
Yeah. There's a series of letters sent to her by other critics, by filmmakers, responding to her pieces that I'd like to go back and just pause and take screenshots of, because frankly you don't get a second to look at them, and they just come back. I mean, I thought that was very badly handled.
I think it's a poor film. Yeah. You know, as a documentary, it's a poor film, and actually without its subject matter, it wouldn't even be worth looking at. I mean, the only reason, you know, why I watched this film and why I would recommend that other people watch it is because of its subject, and because you know, you do get information about the subject that you don't get anywhere else.
The final point I'll make about it being a hagiography is that it doesn't seem to really want to admit that she had faults. It talks about faults that she has, but it always ends up kind of coming across that these faults were really positives in some way.
No,
you know, like her acidity, kind of, she constantly seems to be getting into fights with other critics, criticising them in a way that seems kind of almost unprofessional, really.
Well, not to me.
But it doesn't really admit that anything really might have been a fault about
film critics are the most obsequious, subservient group of writers there is, of critics there is. I mean, it's very difficult to maintain any kind of independence when publicists dangle an interview with Tarantino, you know, or like in this case, you know, what you see over and over again is the extent to which filmmakers and producers, you know, went out of their way to block her, right? So, you know, I mean, they're almost things that would be unheard of now, right? The proposition here is that Warren Beatty went to the trouble of creating a huge, highly paid job for her just to get her out of reviewing and also to humiliate her. Yeah, kind of, you know. Who would bother doing that with a film critic now? Or to change the release date of a film so that it would be covered by someone else and not her, right? And on the other side, to print a whole review as an ad, yeah? So you get kind of all of those different sides. I mean, it's quite extraordinary.
I thought the bit about the release date was interesting. Who was the...
Bob Evans, the producer of Rosemary's Baby, and The Godfather, and The Getaway, and...
Was this a thing about the March the 14th, and she was leaving on March 15th, and he said, don't let her see it, because I want the other reviewer to review it?
That's right.
See, the thing about that was interesting was, he starts off, I think it's on Dick Cavett, a lot of these clips come from Dick Cavett, and he starts off by saying something like, the only critic I don't care if she mauls the film is Pauline Kael. No. Yeah, most critics, I give a shit about, but not Pauline Kael. And then, you know, the act of saying... No, I want the other reviewer to review it. Says you do give a shit.
Well, actually, you give more than to change the whole release of a film So this
I'm
one
not sure
critic,
I'm not sure it was about changing the release. It was just it was being released the day after she would take the hiatus, and he said make sure she does. It was being released the day before rather she would leave, and she wanted it to be the last film she would review before she went on hiatus. And he said just make sure she doesn't see it. Give it to the other reviewer.
yes.
So yeah, but yeah, the point is clearly he gives a shit, and there is this whole strain, as you point out, of men's egos being punctured
Yes.
by her. And
So-
it comes across as very, very true, really. I mean, you can just feel it.
Well, you can just feel it. I mean, without a doubt.
She's a very, very smart woman who speaks her mind and doesn't take any shit. And powerful men really don't like that.
You see, what I find so extraordinary about her is, you know, she's the daughter of Jewish immigrants from Poland who grew up in a chicken ranch in Northern California in the middle of nowhere, right? Yeah, so for her to have become as cultured, as bohemian, yeah, as interested in all of the arts, it's an amazing thing, right? And actually you realize, because people often say, oh my God, you know, she really made her career in her mid-40s, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think by the time that she got the job at the New Yorker, she was 45, 46, it's very late. Yeah, she was very old when she started, right? And then you realize, well, the reason why is because she was this immigrant from Petaluma, or this child of immigrants from Petaluma, right? That it takes a while to get to San Francisco and New York and LA, yeah, and kind of, you know, and that there's an effort of will and a desire, yeah, like to learn and to see and to talk, yeah?
Yeah.
Kind of.
They talk about when she picked up an author that she liked or discovered an author that she liked, she would read everything by them.
Yes. So, it's,
So I have been reading quite a lot of her stuff. I've been picking it up because I really hadn't read any. I mean, I must read the odd review, but I hadn't read anything really. And then I picked up I Lost It at the Movies.
yes.
I was reading quite a lot of that. And I thought, God, this is... I mean, it's just the insight and the mode of speaking, and it really was just the insight. It was the way she would just pick up something and go, oh yeah, that is exactly how this works. And you've put this into words, you've noticed it, and it just makes obvious, perfect sense. Like the movies about posh people at parties in Europe. Was it the Sick Man of Europe parties?
Yes, welcome to the Sick Man of Europe.
You know, and how she just picks up on this trend and points out everything that it meant and signified, and everything that was wrong with it. And you just go, oh yes, yeah, you're exactly right.
I grew up at a time when collections of film criticism were very popular. Yeah. So, you know, you could buy Otis Ferguson and you could buy James Agee, and I forget his name now, but, you know, the guy who wrote on termite art.
Manny Farber.
Manny Farber.
My brother just bought me his book.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. He's wonderful.
Yeah.
Robert De Niro's mom had a long-term affair with Manny Farber.
Okay. That's worth knowing.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, what you realize is that actually these were all circles of friends,
Yes.
right? You know, so I read Dwight MacDonald, and then, you know, there would be like Canadian film critics also who would get their own collections, right? So it was a time when, you know, it was a thing, and there was an interest, and, you know, kind of films were the subject of conversation, the culture, the way I suppose, you know, HBO series or the ilk is now. But the reading kind of was also part of the activity, the reading and the talking, and I suppose the way that it is now. But of all of them, the people who I liked the most, who felt most relevant, was Pauline Kael. I'm one of those people who went and bought the New Yorker just to read her. And I must have been like 15, 16, 17. And, you know, what's interesting is that I didn't get the New Yorker. You know, kind of the New Yorker tone is based on a kind of a snobbery or an elitism of having enormous cultural capital, and not only enormous cultural capital, but the kind of cultural capital that you could only get by living in New York, right? Yeah, by going to the Whitney and the Met, and, you know. So actually, a lot of the New Yorker was not accessible to me. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand the jokes, you know, like a kind of a working class immigrant kid doesn't understand, you know, that upper middle class way of life on which the jokes are based. But I got her, you know, and I understood what she was saying about the movies. and she made me want to see things, right? And she made you think about it. And you think, well, isn't that what criticism really is meant to be about? It's not about being right or wrong, or, you know, whether it fits into this category, it's really that category, which is so much about what scholarship is about, actually. It's about getting people involved in an art form, right? So I valued her then. I bought all of her collections as they came out, and I've never ceased owning them. I was actually surprised to see that the copy of Reeling, you know, that I bought at Classics Bookstore in Montreal in 1977-78 is still the copy of it that I have now. You know, and it's gone through. I mean, I've lived in 5 cities in between, and I've carried it around with me since. So, you know, kind of. Some people might say that says a lot about me and my shortcomings, rather than, you know, as a strength of Pauline Kael's. But I think she's somebody who, in some ways, it's funny because, you know, you were talking about the hagiography. Well, in some ways, I think nobody has held up as well as her. So of all of these people that I'm talking about, you know, kind of Manny Farber's recently in print. James Agee seems to have gone slightly out of fashion, that you could still find him in the library. You know, people like Otis Ferguson, I don't even think are well known anymore. She was out of print for a while, yeah. But I think in some ways she's never been out of the loop of a conversation on American culture. Yeah, she's always been, when you talk about movies in America, when you talk about American movies in American culture, you have to engage with her on some level, right? In that period. On the other hand, you know, she is somebody who's completely absent, largely sneered at, yeah, in academic circles. You know, she seemed to be like the opposite of you know, what academia is meant to be about, and rightly so. She was very anti-academia. You know, she was like not anti-academia, but you know, she was saying as soon as like you put movies in a curriculum, you kill them. You know, like you know, because then people don't respond to the movies. They acquire expected responses, right? Or kind of what you should like, what you shouldn't like. I mean, I'm conscious of that as a teacher sometimes. Yes, like you should like this. It's great, right? Whereas, you know, she was the opposite of that. She wanted audiences to kind of, you know, develop their own responses. Yeah, that your response is valid. Yeah.
One of the critics who's interviewed in this, and I forget his name, he's the guy who you pointed out is a very good reviewer, a very good critic. The guy
James Wolcott.
Sorry?
Was it James Wolcott?
Yes. He said something which I thought, is that true actually? Where he says she didn't believe in absolutes. And, you know, from what I read, I wonder whether that's true, because that she definitely seems to believe in a very clear distinction between sort of artsy, pretentious and popular. I mean, she really sort of kind of supports one and derides the other.
Yes and no, you know, because the thing is, she did very much like art movies, but like with her review of Shoah, yeah, just because it had serious subject matter, right, didn't mean it was good. Just because it was done in an arty way didn't mean it was good, right? Yeah. So I think, you know, the puncturing of the pretentiousness in both popular film and in art cinema, which in those days there was a clear distinction of. Yeah, Hollywood's popular cinema was, you know, Hollywood cinema. Art cinema was, you know, played in art houses and had subtitles, right? I'm trying to think, you know, because obviously foreign cinema is popular in its own country, right?
Yeah, and then it comes to the West, or the West, it comes to America and becomes art cinema. Yes,
though some things are very arty, but there is a difference, for example, between, you know, the artiness of Antonioni or the artiness of De Sica. So she's responding to De Sica. She's not responding to Antonioni.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up De Sica, because one of the things I was thinking for the first half hour or more of the film is I'm not getting enough of a sense here of what she loves. The film, at least for the opening, is very, very keen on what she doesn't like. And what she doesn't like, when she doesn't like it, is very entertaining and it's quite insightful and all the rest of it. but I'm thinking like there's this other side to her, right? What she loves, and you only see it in they bring up a review of Shoeshine, where she talks about having broken up with someone and gone to the movie and then coming out in tears and not knowing whether her tears are for herself or for the characters in the film, and how much she identified with the two boys. And it's a great response, and it's really heartfelt and beautiful. But that's the only impression I get from the start. The film seems much more interested in what she doesn't like and her combativeness, and not just with films, but with, as I said, other critics, filmmakers.
I think that's true to a degree, though. For example, at the very beginning of the film, they go to great lengths to show you how much she loved 1930s cinema.
That's true.
You know, and the wisecracking dames, and you know, the sharp, intelligent women, and you know, the retorts, and a kind of an unsentimental attitude that they all had. You know, so and I think certainly reading her criticism, you very much know who she loved. She loved Barbra Streisand, right? She loved musicals.
Well, then that's a problem with the film.
Yeah,
because the film does not give you that impression at all.
Yeah. You know what I really hated, and I don't know how else to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I hated the Sarah Jessica Parker readings of her reviews because it occupies too much space. You know, so obviously, like, think for example if you'd seen a documentary on Mailer or Dickens, right? You know, the documentary wouldn't be reading you passages of all of their works. That's ridiculous, right? It would be focusing on the life, the career, other people's responses, the influence on the field, or the life itself. I mean, one of the things that really that I really didn't like is the way that the film glosses over her relationships, right? You know, this is a story about a woman, about a person. I'd like to know what was important in their lives, right? Who she married, and who the father of her child was, and you know,
the film does it very, very quickly.
James Broughton is the father of Gina James, her daughter.
Yeah.
And
the film says he hooks up with her and or has his child, it says, which is an interesting phrasing.
Yes.
Makes it sound like an agreement.
Well, it could be, and let me tell you why. So nobody knows, right? But the father was James Broughton, a very famous poet and experimental filmmaker, very, very famous, and also a figure in, the Beat generation. He was a figure in the gay liberation movement. He was the founder of Radical Fairies, which so he was well, who knows what people's sex lives really are, right? You know, but he had many associations with gay culture of the period. Right. I think he was also married subsequently and had children, right? So, you know, when you say, it felt almost like a deal, it could have been,
yeah.
You know. And actually that would have been interesting to know.
Yeah,
right?
But it's true to say the film totally glosses it over.
Yeah, and I think it's important to gloss over, because one of the things that gay men, a little older than I, and maybe a little bit more politicized than I, had as a certainty was Pauline Kael's homophobia, which I disagree with.
Right.
Yeah, you know, but I think, you know, there's something, she says something in a review of Funny Lady or something, you know, that then was, certain phrases were picked up as proof of her homophobia, which again, you know, you think, well, things are so much more interesting and so much more complex, because clearly, you know, in her real life, she wasn't. So, you know, and actually, maybe the use of certain phrases comes from being too inside the culture, that you feel free with their use, and then don't realize how they'll play in a larger setting, right?
I had read one or two things of hers that where just the word homosexuals just sort of stands out in comparison with heterosexuals. And she talks about the way homosexuals act or think, or the way they behave as audiences or something like that. And I never put it down as homophobia, but I put it down as like that was actually kind of the way people spoke at the time almost. Maybe,
but you also have to remember a context in which the very word homosexual wasn't allowed in polite society. I mean, I would look it up, but I think the New York Times did not use the word homosexual until, you know, the 80s. Actually, let's look that up. You know, because it was a story. Oops.
Right.
It says here, the New York Times is the first major publication to use the word homosexuality in 1926.
Okay, here we go. I've got an article in the New York Times that was written for Pride 2017
Yes.
called How the Times Gave Gay Its Own Voice, brackets again, by David Dunlap. I'm gay. I could not have written these words in the New York Times 30 years ago. Not out of fear, my family, friends and colleagues had known for quite a while. No, because I could not have written these words because our manual of style and usage prohibited it. Gay. Do not use as a synonym for homosexual unless it appears in the formal capitalised name of an organisation or in quoted matter.
There you go.
Liberation arrived on June 15th, 1987 in a note to the staff from Alan M. Siegel, who was then an assistant managing editor. Quote, starting immediately, we will accept the word gay as an adjective meaning homosexual.
Okay.
Maybe that's what you're referring
That's
to.
That's what I was referring to, though. I got it muddled. Yeah.
So it means that homosexual was in use before then.
Yeah.
And not gay.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it would have had several connotations and it would have incurred a frisson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one of the things... I think actually the film's greatest pro, you know, the thing that's best about it, is that it's kind of it's a fan film, basically. And if you are a fan, and if you're not that... You don't take too much of a critical eye on it, I suppose. It's quite pleasurable just to sort of sit in the company of these people, reminiscing about this great woman and her work, and seeing all these clips that... The clips of all these films, there's a huge variety of them, and they pass by pretty much entirely unnamed. You know,
Yes.
the only time they'll be named is when someone is talking about the film. Pauline Kael will be, or Sarah Jessica Parker will be reciting a Kael review about the film, and you're seeing the clips that she's speaking about, and that's kind of nice. Most of the time, actually, the clips are illustrative, like in the most basic way, like the specific film that's being used. You know, you have a clip from Star Wars, and Han Solo says something like, "I'm starting to like her," and it's like it's because the film at that point is talking about people starting to like Pauline Kael. It's just illustrative. That's it.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of pleasure actually in the torrent of clips I found.
Yes, there is, and they're very good quality clips. And if you do recognize some of them, they are very pertinent to what the voiceover is saying. Yeah.
Some of them are, yeah. They're not all that rudimentary, but a lot of them are that as well. And they are just filling in space, more so than the recited reviews. Because actually, I think the thing about the recited reviews that I didn't mind was, if you're talking about a film critic, it's nice to have examples of the criticism in the film, so we know what we're talking about.
I suppose. I mean, you need some of that, but you didn't need that much of it.
I must say, I didn't actually mind it all that much.
I did. I kind of, it was a recurring thing. And of course, what she is famous for is her writing. But there are ways of talking about her writing without having an actress read passages of it that really create a tempo for the film. It doesn't happen once. It happens many times. And actually, I really cannot think of any other documentary I've seen on writers which does that. So, you might have a documentary on Fitzgerald that at some point reads the closing lines of The Great Gatsby or something, right? But that would be about it, or, kind of...
But maybe the documentary is worse for that, if that's the case, because we're talking about a writer, we're talking about their work. If you had a documentary about a filmmaker, you would show clips of their work.
But
that would seem very obvious.
Yeah, and if you were writing about Kael's writing, you would also include lots of passages of her writing, and it would enhance the argument. But there is something about the visual medium, where writing is such a central structural aspect of it, that I think did not work in the film's favor. Even though I laughed, I appreciated her writing.
Yes.
I responded to her writing even orally.
And I bet it made you think, I'll go off and read some more of her stuff.
Well,
I kind of think, look, if the film doesn't also talk about her significance or whatever, then that's just the film's fault for not, there's room to do that and talk about her writing.
Well, you see, for example, there are so many things that I would like to know more about that the film doesn't offer, right? So there was all of her first trip to New York, where she tried, to become an artist and failed. Mm-hmm. That in itself is a wonderful story, right? So i.e. this career as a critic is based on a failed career as an artist, right? Something that people accuse critics of, of doing to begin with. That's, that would be a wonderful platform to discuss many ideas of art and criticism, right? When she returns to California and she begins writing she begins to go on the radio and she begins writing the program notes for the cinema, I would like to know a whole lot more about that career, because the film tells you, she was in touch with all of the artistic sets. She knew everybody, right? She was very social. Well, you want to know, who did she know? Like, what was her relations with all of these people? Did she contribute to that art scene? Is she actually part of that whole art scene in a way that we don't know about? Yeah. Later on at the end of the film, when they show you her holding hands with her sister, well, it's the first time you realize she has a sister. She talks about her brothers running that farm earlier on, but there's no mention of a sister. What was her family life like? This is meant to be a biographical work on this great critic, and you come up with more questions than answers.
Yeah, but I would say ultimately that all of those failings would not be remedied by taking out the clips of Sarah Jessica Parker talking.
Well, they'd be remedied by using the huge chunks of time that takes to...
I don't think there was that much time. And the film is as long as it wants to be. It's, an hour and 40 minutes, which seems roughly appropriate, I suppose. But I don't think it's like the time you save removing those is time you put into that. I don't think there was any interest in any of that in the film. They would have spent time on it otherwise. They would have. I actually don't think that the film has... The film is too simple. It's not interested in that.
Well, it's true. It's simple. Yeah, it lacks complexity for sure.
It doesn't ask any of the right questions about her. Any that you've just asked. These things you want to know more about.
So there's a room for other better films about Kael. The interesting thing is I can't think of any other critic except maybe Bazin who has had films made about them. Can you?
About them? No, I don't. No, I've no.
I suppose Roger Ebert's had a film made about him recently, actually.
Has he?
Yeah, I think his widow made a film about him.
Right.
Certainly about his last years, yeah.
Yeah.
But, they're very,
Well, the film is very interested in Pauline Kael's significance as a critic at the time, and it's very interested more generally in the influence that critics had or could have.
Yeah.
To the point where... Because that's really not the case these days.
No.
so it's to the point where, as someone who wasn't around in that generation, you're going, how true is that?
It's true.
Yeah. It must be.
You see, all of the release patterns were very different. As someone who grew up in Montreal, right, you'd often read the New York Times on Sunday, and, kind of a film would appear, and the reviews would be out, and the reviews would be plastered over the ads. Right, but it hadn't arrived to Montreal yet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes it did, because actually Montreal was included in a small release of, the 30 top Lowe's theaters or whatever. So Montreal was often included in the initial release, but sometimes it wasn't. Anyway, what I'm trying to describe is a pattern where, you'd have films that are platformed, they're released maybe in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York for a week. And then they open up to 30 cinemas, and so they include New York and, New Orleans or whatever, right? Yeah, and then kind of, they would play in one cinema if they were hits. They would play in one cinema for a year, right? Like, I think Annie Hall played in Montreal in one theater for a whole year, you know? Right? So it means that important critics, like the critics of the New Yorker, the New York Times, Chicago, the local critics were always important. Kind of they had time to build up a film, right? Like kind of, your life did not depend on the first week's release. Actually, all of that marketing spending that you have now was a way of getting around critics, right? That advertising strategy of initially of releasing it in 700 or 1,000 cinemas, and spending a fortune on television advertising was, you blitz, viewers, and kind of you can ignore critics for the first week, right? Like, because the review, the word of mouth wouldn't have been built up, so you can collect all of your money in the first few weeks. That's, I think, one of the great factors and what's behind contemporary patterns of distribution. Right?
Yeah, that started with Jaws, right? Pretty much.
Well,
TV spots for Jaws and things.
Yeah, I think Jaws, I don't know if it started with Jaws, but Jaws was certainly a good example of a successful distribution like that. But that's because, it was initially seen as an exploitation film about a shark, right? But the normal thing is that films would be allowed to build. right? And that 1, 2, 3-year runs were not unheard of, you know? I mean, if you read about films like Ben-Hur in the West End, right? They played for like 3 years in the West End, or, you know, like, you know, kind of. I think Sheldon Hall has written on this, you know, what were the longest releases in the West End, and I forget now. You know, but West Side Story ran for years, South Pacific ran for years, you know, Ben-Hur ran for years, right? So when something runs for years, it means that kind of, you know, reviews count, yeah, and reviews are discussed, and they form part of the discussion of the film, yeah, that contributes to word of mouth, right? And so I think kind of critics had a different role to play then. Also, the written word had a different role in the culture than it does now.
It's more significant.
Yes.
They do talk at the end of this film about if she were reviewing today, you know, what would it be like? Would she still be important? Because media has become so much more fragmented. Anyone who wants to can put up a blog, start a podcast, you know, whatever they like, and no one necessarily has to pay attention to them. So it's obvious that like it's much harder to get any kind of purchase and see your work as a critic kind of become significant. No one has that. What they're talking about, like I said, is what they're talking about with Pauline Kael and the critics around her is totally unrecognisable today.
It's totally unrecognisable. So one of the interesting things, I'm always interested in money. Money tells you a lot. You know, much more important than adjectives. So, you know, she's constantly talking about, or the film constantly tells you, that the New Yorker did not pay a living wage. You know, she had to go and lecture and, yeah, the other 6 months and so on. And I was thinking, well, I would be very curious to see how much the New Yorker paid her, right? And compare that to an average American wage of the period. Because what you see at the end of the film is, you know, that like, I don't know, 10 years before she retires, kind of, she buys a mansion. It looks like a mansion, right?
Yeah, out
you
of
know,
the country.
Yeah, in Connecticut. I mean, you know, it isn't in like Kansas boondock. It's like, you know, within commuting distance to New York. And it's a fucking mansion, right? So how, you know, and she only began to earn a decent paying job when she was 45, 46. So, you know, the New Yorker must have paid her enough to save to buy that house. Like, yeah.
Am I thinking of a different house? I thought that sort of farmhouse looking place was in Massachusetts.
Okay, sorry, Massachusetts.
Oh, was it?
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I'm saying Connecticut. It might have been Massachusetts.
Yeah. Okay.
In any case, it's within commuting distance of New York.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And
It's
a
on
nice
the
big
East
country
Coast.
house it was.
Yeah, I mean, they say she was very poorly paid, but it doesn't bear any comparison to now, where people are either not paid or they're paid by the word. Yeah, I mean, you know, film criticism as a profession has been completely devalued because nobody can actually live on it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't getting paid in exposure, was she?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, she was getting paid in money.
And speaking of getting paid in exposure, one of the things that I really loved hearing was her declaration to the radio station, you know, that unless she started getting paid for her radio work, that this would be her last one, and doing it on air. I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah. Well, good radio. I mean, it's like when Danny Baker went mental on the BBC a few years ago because he was told he was getting fired. He was getting refreshed out the schedules. And they told him this just before he went on air. And he lost it.
I bet. Yeah, well,
and it was fantastic radio.
Yeah, who wouldn't? I mean, imagine telling someone before they go on air.
I know, it's such a stupid thing to do. But yeah.
I remember the Renata Adler Demolition Job coming out. And I remember thinking how nasty she was. What a bitch. That bitch Renata Adler. And actually I've subsequently read, I forget if it was a biography or it was a memoir by Renata Adler, you know, in which she talks about how the perception of her that way remained ever after. And rightly so, right? Because so one of the interesting things about Pauline Kael is that you think that what drives her criticism is love. Yeah, it's love of the medium or love of the movies. I mean, you know, so even when she kind of writes snappishly or whatever, it's because of how things could be better and how they could be beautiful. Yeah, you know, it's not out of meanness really. Though, you know, kind of they say, oh, she could be cruel. Well, she could be cruel in the sense that she didn't mind firing, when she thought it deserved it. But I don't think even that came out of, so she could be cruel, but I don't think cruelty was her main impetus. I think, her main impetus was love. Whereas Renata Adler was a bitch. I mean, the whole reason for doing that essay was as a demolition job. It was like really calculated to demolish, right? And I'm glad that the largest effect has been on her in her very unsisterly act, right? Because the thing about Renata Adler, she had also been a New Yorker reviewer earlier. So, karma. But I thought what was interesting was to have all the other letters of appreciation from Spielberg and and actors and and so on. So I mean kind of Spielberg saying you're the only one who's ever really gotten this movie, and so on. To me, is kind of significant, really.
Yeah. Jaws she got.
Yeah.
Apparently, and no one else did.
Yeah. According to Spielberg, maybe he was just buttering her up.
Maybe, but that's also one of those things that you say, well, now I want to go and read a review of Jaws.
Yeah.
I want to know what she said, what she got that no one else did.
Yeah.
So
overall, I would really recommend this film, but I would really recommend this film not as a documentary, which is it's entertaining, but it's not innovative, it's not very good, really. But actually, the subject matter to me remains fascinating, and I'm very glad I saw it. Yeah,
it's like if you're already interested, then there's entertainment and kind of points of interest here, but you kind of bring a lot of it yourself as well. Like the film actually isn't doing very much itself to render things interesting or ask the right questions. It's not a very good documentary. No.
All right, thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.